Hey, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. You're listening to the longest running superhero role playing game on Earth. I'm your host, the Game Master. And if you follow the podcast, you have probably noticed that I just got done uploading a handful of adventures that were all set around the year 2000. So this episode then has to kind of address what I think of as the elephant in the room, which is the year 2001. And the biggest thing that happened that year, of course. So I guess let me start here. I'm not a big fan of the phrase trigger warning. I feel like sometimes people use it in kind of a weird way that I don't like. But that said, this kind of is my trigger warning for this video. I have some dear friends who lost somebody that day. My best friend, his wife was home on maternity leave when her place where normally she worked was destroyed, right? So like it's a sensitive thing for their family. Um, so if you feel like you fall into that category, then by all means, just skip to the next video. The last thing I want to do is hurt somebody's feelings or bring up bad memories or whatever. But we felt like, well, let me start at the beginning. So I owned the local comic book store that morning. I actually overslept that morning. I woke up late, saw the time. I was living in Columbus, Ohio at the time. I hurried around and I jumped in my Jeep. I was driving a little black Geo Tracker, and I hadn't been living there very long. And I noticed when I jumped in the Jeep, I was pretty much out of gas. So I had not much money on me at the time. I can't remember how much it would have been, maybe like $10 or something. And I found a gas station, and it was not a prepay thing back then. I put whatever the amount of gas was, and I went in and I was wanting this guy to take my money, and put it in the register. And he was watching TV and totally ignoring me. And so what I did not realize was it had already started, right? It was on TV, but I had not turned on a TV yet or, whatever. Actually, I never really watched a TV until the very, very end of the day, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So he's just staring at the TV and totally ignoring me. And I even said something to him and he didn't look at me. And I was like, whatever, dude, and I put the money down and I paid for the gas, but I just left the money on the counter. And I told him, I said, hey, there's like exact change on the counter. And he still was ignoring me. And so I go jump in my Jeep and I, drive on all these little one-way streets to get to where the highway is. And I grew up in the country on a farm. I despise city driving and having to merge and get onto, and I can't remember how many lanes this highway is. It's like a five lane highway or four-lane highway or something like that, right? And it's just one of those things where every morning I would like turn off the radio to merge with traffic, and I was always freaking out, looking in the rear view mirror and yada yada yada. And I remember this moment where I looked in the rear view mirror and there was nobody on the road at all. I mean, literally nobody. I was the only car on the road. That that was shocking to me. And in a way, it reminded me of the visuals now that we would have something like from the Walking Dead TV show, where I was just like, what? Like, how is there nobody on the what is happening? And I didn't know what was really going on yet. And so when I would drive to work, and it was kind of a long drive, it was about, I want to say about an hour and a half drive. back then for me to go to work. And I would listen to these guys in the morning called Bob and Tom, and they were funny, I thought, at the time anyway. And so I turned them on, and they're being real serious. And I'm still kind of looking at the rear view mirror, and like my mind is not really on their words yet, if that makes sense. I'm still just kind of like, what is happening right now, right? And I'm kind of picking up speed going down the highway, and I, set my cruise control, or I'm doing whatever it is I'm doing. And then I slowly start, my mind drifts back to their words, and they're being serious. They're not being funny. And I remember being kind of like, why, what is happening? Why are these guys not funny now? And then one of them says, we just got a report there's been a second plane now. And so prior to that day, I would watch the news, and every so often an airplane would crash, right? Like in a field or the ocean or whatever. And so I thought that's like what they were talking about. And on the drive, and like I say, it's kind of a long drive, everything kind of unfolds. So I'm hearing it all over the radio. I'm not really seeing the images. And I'm a little embarrassed to say this because as a kid, I hated, like, I never watched police shows. I never watched movies about guys in the army. I never watched anything about the Old West. I joke with people that I only cared about two things when I was younger: boobs and lasers, right? And if a movie or a TV show didn't have either of those things, I did not watch it, right? That just that's where I was at. I was all about escapism. I liked things that were fantastic and unrealistic, and something that because my life was kind of bad. I won't go on a big tangent about it, but I had a hard life. And I didn't just want stuff that reminded me of real life. I wanted the opposite, right? And so when people would talk about realistic things when I was growing up, or they'd talk about the news or politics or whatever, I tuned it all out. And so as a result, there have been a lot of things over the years that I didn't know anything about it at all when everybody else did, right? And so on the radio, when I even heard the World Trade Center, I had no idea what that even was, you know? Um, that'll make people mad sometimes when I tell them that. There's probably going to be a lot of things. If ever there was a podcast episode of mine that's going to make people want to unsubscribe to my channel, this is probably the one. I don't mean to hurt anybody's feelings. I'm just being brutally honest, right? I was just ignorant, you know? I did not know. And so I hear what happened, but I didn't get it, right? Like it didn't resonate with me yet. And I was like, okay. And then I was kind of like, well, but why aren't people going to work? And my thing at the time was like, when I'd seen these other things on the news about an airplane that crashes in the ocean or something like that is a tragedy, right? That's people lost their lives in that moment, but then like everybody still goes to work though. You know what I mean? So like I did not get it yet. And like my kids, as much as I've told my kids about this, my kids don't get it, and their friends don't get it, you know? My son was a teacher until very recently, and he had students that would make fun of September 11th, right? Because they weren't born yet. So they don't get it either. But the point is, so I go to work. I go to the comic book store, and I start doing what I do every day, which is I start counting up the drawer for the cash register. I flip the sign to open, I turn on the lights, I whatever. And the the comic book store was in like this little strip mall with metal siding. And so the radio, it was very hard to get the radio to pick up radio stations. So I would always just put a CD in, and it would be something like Weird Al Yankovic, or They Might Be Giants, like the Flood album. It was always stuff like that. It was pretty typical stuff, I think, for comic book stores in my area at that time. And so then I had an employee who worked in the back room named Olivia, and she came in and she was like, "Are we working today?" And I said, "Yeah, why wouldn't we work today?" And she's like, did you see the TV?" And I said, "No, I haven't seen a TV yet." And so she's telling me about it. And I'm seeing how upset she is. And that is my first taste of kind of like seeing the effect it's having on people, right? And I'm like, "Oh, okay." And I was like, "Well, look, if you want to go home, you can go home. Like, I'm not going to make you be here. You know, do what you want to do." And all she did was eBay stuff. So it wasn't time sensitive. It wasn't, she could have done it from home if she wanted. And I was like, "No, I'm a nice guy or whatever. Do what you want to do, man." And she's like, "Oh, okay, well, I guess I'll work." And I was like, "Okay, if you want." And she's like, "You're gonna work?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I'm for sure gonna work." She's like, "Okay." And so she went back in the back, and so then I don't know if she had something over the internet, because that was kind of the early days of the internet. I don't think YouTube was a thing yet. If it was, I certainly had not heard of it at the time. She was somehow getting the news back there, and she would kind of pop her head out every now and again and kind of update me. And so, of course, the story is unfolding, and now there's something involving the Pentagon, and there was a plane in a field, and like things are kind of what would you call that? Amping up? I don't know what to call it. But there's more and more information reaching us, right? And so kind of everything is sinking in for me on my end, where I'm starting to understand like this is not like earlier um catastrophes or disasters or whatever you want to call that. This is not like that. This is something else. And so then what happens is customers start to show up. And I remember this one guy, Matt. I won't say his last name. I'll try to not say anybody's last names because I don't want to embarrass anybody. But I remember this guy, Matt. He showed up, and he's like, this is our last day on Earth. This today is it. We're gonna die. And I was like, "What are you talking about, Matt?" And he's like, "Well, because there's a military airport not far from here, and someone's gonna crash something into that airport." And I said, "Well, yeah, but that's like out of town. I How would that hurt us here this far away?" He's like, "No, there's enough planes in the air. You don't understand how many planes there are in the world, and all the planes are weapons now." And he was really, really freaked out, and he genuinely thought that was his last day on Earth. And it's easy to look back at that and kind of laugh at him and say, "Well, obviously he was wrong." The thing that I noticed though was this guy thought this was his last day on Earth, and he came to me. And then he wasn't the only one. There were a bunch of people in that category. Because, and I mentioned this before on the podcast too, when I was a kid in the 80s, if you liked comic books where I lived, you just got beat up. When I was in high school, if I told people that I enjoyed watching Star Trek The Next Generation, no girl would date me. You know what I mean? Um, it's not like now where you have like hot cosplay chicks, and the Marvel movies are like the biggest money makers of the summer. You know what I mean? It's a very different world now than it was then. And so back then, if you liked this stuff, you were kind of an outcast. And again, this is regional. If you live in some other part of the world, that maybe was not the case for you. I'm not trying to say it was, but where I lived, right, it was absolutely the case. And so the customers would come to my store to be around people that they felt a kinship to, right? It was a community. And so many people literally thought it was their last day, and maybe their own family was mean to them or bullied them for their interests or for being awkward or whatever, that it became shoulder to shoulder in the store. And everybody came in and they would just sit down on the carpet. And because I had a gaming table, kind of mentioned that before, but up kind of like by the front window, I had a long gaming table. And so there were aluminum like folding chairs around that, but not a ton, It could maybe seat 20 or 30 people. I don't know. I'm kind of bad at guessing, but God, we had easily over 100 people. I mean, it would have to be way more than that. We maybe had like 200 people in my store. It was pretty big. It was a good sized store, but they all just sat down on the carpet, and they thought, like, not all of them, but a lot of them, they either thought they were going to die, or and part of that was Matt the whole time was really kind of um like, metaphorically speaking, he was the guy yelling fire in a movie theater. You know what I mean? Um so if someone showed up and they weren't thinking it before, Matt certainly was putting the thought in people's heads. Um and he was agitated, and he gets loud when he's agitated, and I was kind of telling him, like, chill out a little, Matt, chill out, and he was like, it's a free country and I can say whatever I want, and da 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 da, and we're all gonna die. And um so yeah, it was a weird day. And I sold pop. I had like Mountain Dew and Pepsi. That might have been it. I don't think I had a third flavor. Where I would get these big cases, big 24 packs or whatever. And I just gave everybody free pop that day. People bought, I sold little bags of, Doritos or pretzels or something, along those lines. They bought all my snacks. And to the best of my knowledge, I did not sell a single comic book all day long. But we were there for a long time. And maybe around supper time that night, nobody left for lunch. Everybody just sat around on the carpet. And then they got hungry around supper time, and kind of everybody left. And the guy who owned the store before me, whose name was Dave, he showed up, and he's like, I can't believe you're open. And I said, we were the busiest we've ever been, ever. And he was like, really? And I told him about it. And he thought that was pretty weird. And he's like, well, I don't think anything's going to happen. And if I were you, I would just close up and go home. And I was like, yeah, I might, now, because every place else was closed. And so I did. I closed. I couldn't tell you what time it was. I closed a little early, and I started to drive home. And in all the excitement of the day, I mentioned earlier that I didn't have much money on me that morning. So I didn't put a whole lot of money in my gas tank. And in all the excitement, I completely forgot how low I was on gas. So I'm driving south on this major highway, and I'm like, well, when I get to Columbus, I will put some gas in it there. And they had it shut off. They weren't letting anybody in or out of the city. And I don't know if it was the National Guard or I'm bad at military stuff to tell you what, branch or whatever it would have been, but there were military vehicles on the road and they said you're not allowed in or out tonight. I was like, really? I was like, well, that sucks because I'm out of gas. I was like, I'm kind of in a bad spot here, guys. Like, I don't suppose anybody has like a couple bucks I could bum off of you. And they were like, nope, get out of here. And so I turned around and I ended up going back to my childhood town and I barely had the gas to get there. And I went to my grandma's house and walked in the door and it was dark out. I couldn't tell you what time of night it was or whatever, but it was dark. And she still had the TV going and she'd been watching everything all day long and she was just freaking out. She was like, "Oh my God, thank God you're okay," And I was like, I'm fine. I was at work today and I'm fine. And I remember she was like, "I want you to move home. I don't like that you don't live at home anymore. I really want you to move home." And I mentioned that because I think that's interesting as a way of saying how different people were thinking back then. And I've known so many people. I left Columbus almost immediately after that. My wife moved home after that. Like a lot of people, moved home. And I think part of it was maybe people were seeking comfort. Again, I probably shouldn't speculate, but that's just sort of, I kind of wonder if that was it. Was people wanted the familiar, people wanted comfort, stuff like that. So I spent the night at grandma's house. The next morning, when we had a gas station in town at the time, tiny little town, kind of like Mayberry or Smallville, that kind of thing. Um, when the gas station opened up, she gave me 20 bucks or something, and I went and threw some gas in the tank, went to work, pocketed $20 from the register to give her, that night when I'd go back. And so that was yeah, the 12th. And as it just so happens, was comic book day. And one of the comic books that we got was the new reboot of the G.I. Joe comic by Devil's Due. And we sold out. Everybody wanted it because if you remember the old 80s intro to G.I. Joe, they were an anti-terrorist organization, right? And and so this is kind of where I'm going with this was I remember how the 11th where I lived was all about fear, right? That was the theme. The 12th, and by the way, everybody was united, right? Everybody, nobody felt like they were right wing or left wing or anything like that. Everybody, where I lived, anyways, was just an American, and they were mad. They were really mad. And I remember and this guy, Carl, is these days probably the most left wing person I know, right? I remember Carl walked into the shop that morning and he said, "I've got two words for you: glass desert. We should nuke them. We should just, and he would go on a big tangent. I won't, I'm sure I'd get, whatever in trouble with YouTube if I repeated the kind of stuff he was saying. And he's like, "Don't you think?" And I was like, "I don't know, man. I'm not a political guy. And like, I don't call the shots. Other people make the decisions. I just sell comic books, like I'm just gonna kind of do my thing, man." And everybody wanted to talk about politics suddenly, which like we never really did in the store. And and boy, were they angry. Everybody was just furious. Um, yeah. So so then the kind of the next layer of this story is I had a guy walk in who was one of my gamers. And he's like, everybody would say, like, did you hear what happened? And I'm like, yeah, I kind of heard. It was kind of noticeable, buddy. Um, but we get to talking, and this people started to say the same thing to me over and over again. And I thought this was really weird. So a bunch of people would say, yeah, you know what my first thought was I wish that our characters from the game were real so that they could have done something. And I thought, that's interesting that like your first thought was the game. I, for me, I didn't think about the game at all that day, you know? Um, I had so many people saying that. I had so many people saying, because like I said, the John Redbridge character from our role-playing game, who is heavily mentioned on the podcast, he was he was kind of the store mascot. We had a mural of him on the wall. And I mean, I guess that was part of it, is people would come in and they'd see the mural and then they'd mention it and they'd be like, man, he should go to the Middle East. He should take these guys out. And it was not a small number. I don't mean like a dozen people said that. I mean like 50 people or 75 people or something all said that. They were like, no, 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 yeah. He would make pretty short work of these guys. And and again, it was all about everybody wanted revenge. And so I'm trying to think how I want to talk about this. So then, well, we did not play that week. That following, because I want to say the 12th was a Wednesday. So I think we were supposed to play Friday night. Everybody had come in person between Wednesday and Friday. And I just told everybody, kind of with everything going on, um, I need a minute to think. This is obviously like a huge deal. Up until that point, if there was some sort of an event in real life, we would put it in the game some way, shape, or form, right? And up until then, this is another thing I feel like a lot of younger listeners might not know about or whatever. Up until then, with comic books, the stories kept ramping up in the late 90s there. And there had been a Justice League story, for instance, where there's this race that it was something about they wanted to know who God was or something. And at the end of the day, they decided to make God. And so they built a gigantic DNA helix where every particle or whatever in the helix was a different planet. And so this race was going through space, spearing planets on this giant thing, right? This helix shaped thing. I don't even know if you'd call it a starship or what at that point. But Earth got speared in that comic book and taken out of our solar system, and all sorts of crazy stuff was going on in that. And I mention that because comics just kept amping up and they kept getting bigger. And around the same time as all of this, September of 2001, they did the Imperiex story in DC, Our Worlds at War. And interestingly enough, in Metropolis, there were two towers that Lex Luthor owned, and it was kind of an anime style a beam weapon, like almost like a Death Star level cannon thing that he had built, is what these towers actually were. And it had gotten fired. during the course of Our Worlds at War, and it was eerily similar to what happened in real life. And in that comic, people did not react the way people reacted in real life, right? And in my humble opinion, that disconnect there actually killed the comic book industry. And I've never heard anybody talk about this, but I think that the nature of comic books is sort of to say, like Batman needs to kind of fight crime because the police can't cut it, right? Or, insert hero here, Spider-Man or somebody, they're doing the job because the authorities aren't up to snuff. But in September of 2001, right, the sentiment was, firemen are heroes, ambulance drivers are heroes. These are real heroes. The quote unquote superheroes are make believe fairy tale BS. And um, we need for the real life stuff to be in the spotlight and they have to be important. And so I felt like overnight, the tone of comic books was subverted. And I'm not saying whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, but that the old comic book world was suddenly gone because everything had been about just go bigger, right? Go bigger. And then all of a sudden it was like, no, 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 we need to go small. This needs to be more grounded. It needs to be, you know? And I feel like we're kind of just now starting to see people come back from that. So stuff like the Invincible TV show, um, Omni-Man does a lot of collateral damage on that show that I felt like had kind of fallen out of style there for a while, you know? Well, so in the comics, DC and Marvel had to decide like how do we move forward from this moment in history, right? Do we act like it never happened? Because there are people who would get mad at that. And they would say something like I lost a brother or I lost my wife or something, right? They get really mad about that if you acted like it didn't happen. But then if you put it in the comic book, if they just did a comic book where it's like, oh yeah, whatever, Superman sees that happens, so he just flies around the world and things go back in time like he did in the Christopher Reeve movie, and he just fixes it. He just stops the plane in the air. You know what I mean? People would be mad about that. So it was this huge like lose-lose situation, right? The art I'm using for this episode this week is I think the big image everybody, well, there's sort of two images everybody thinks of, in my opinion. For Marvel, it's this one. It's the moment that Spider-Man sees what happened. He sees the Twin Towers are down, you know. Um, and then you turn the page, I think. This is the black cover issue of Spider-Man. You turn the page and he kind of web slings down to street level and there are people and they say, where were you? How could you let this happen? And that was, I think, how Marvel chose to address it was in that one issue. And I think one of the reasons they chose Spider-Man, aside from the fact that he's a New Yorker, is that he can't fly around the world and turn back time, right? um so that's how they navigated that. And then the other thing, I said there were two images I think everybody thinks of. The other one was over at DC, Alex Ross, who done Kingdom Come, did this oil painting of, I can't remember now if it's Superman or if it's Superboy, but it's Clark, and he's standing next to, I think it's Crypto, and they're looking up at this billboard that's just larger than life, and everybody on the billboard, it's again realistic paintings of firemen and nurses and you know what I mean, the first responders. And so Clark says something like wow, or so, whatever, that he's in awe of them. That's, yeah, like I say, a pretty iconic moment when it comes to comic book fandom, right? So just as Marvel and DC had to decide, well, what do we do, right? I had to decide that too for the game. And the thing is, in the game, for sure, like time travel is a power in the book, right? And we had characters over the years like Tachyon and stuff like that who travel through time. I mean, honestly, any Green Lantern has omni power on his character sheet and could just substitute that for the time travel power and go back and stop it from happening. And so I had to really think about that. And I'm lucky in a way because the players I had at the time, a lot of them were suggesting stuff like that. Well, I mean, there were multiple suggestions. Like I said, there were a bunch of people were like, we think John Redbridge should just go, fly around, carve up the Middle East with heat vision, rip it off the face of the earth, and throw the whole place into the sun. I had people saying stuff like that. And then I had people saying, I think he should, go back in time, keep it from happening, or we think so and so, we think this character is psychic. They would have known it was coming. They would have leapt into action. There's a lot of stuff like that. And so I said at the time, kind of like what I already said about, you're going to upset people. Because, like, one of our players, John Boggs, I mentioned this before, he had joined the army in 1998. Um, he would come home on leave or something like that. And he, at the time, was playing a character named Visage. That was kind of this ghost like character that would kind of fade out of existence while John was overseas. And then on the rare times John would come home, Visage would appear again, and if he was home for Christmas or something, he'd play with us almost every day, every chance he got. He loved gaming. And then he had to go back to the Middle East, and Visage would vanish again. So for instance, with John, I remember reaching out to him and saying, how do you think I should handle this? You know? And he wasn't sure. He agreed it was a mess. He didn't like the idea of saying it never happened, or saying soldiers are obsolete, or you know what I mean? He didn't want any of that. I was like, okay, because I feel like people's feelings in real life for me is the priority there, right? And whatever we do in the game, is flexible. So we decided that it happened. And then um boy, there's a bunch of stuff going on here. So like I said, I had all these people who at the time they were really pushing for revenge. And for the gamers we had in September and October of 2001, which some of the other gaming groups I had just kind of fizzled out before that, like the Green Lanterns and so on and so forth. But for the current gaming group at the time, they unanimously voted for revenge, right? And by the way, none of them would stand behind that now. None of them would be like, yeah, we did a good job handling that, or that was well thought out. Nobody would feel that way now. I should also probably mention something else. Around the year 2000, I mentioned this in an earlier podcast. We had brought a bunch of different characters from different points in time and space. We had brought them to our game world to the year 2000. And one of the characters that we brought was Tarna the Terrakian from an old movie called Heavy Metal. I loved heavy metal. I still love heavy metal. As a brief aside, by the way, when I was at the Art Institute of Pittsburgh, one of my professors actually he had worked on that movie. There's a sequence involving a World War II bomber that crashes on an island, and then there are zombies. Yeah, he was one of the animators for that. But my favorite part of heavy metal was, I think it's the last sequence, is the Tarna sequence. And Tarna is this beautiful woman with white hair, kind of a skimpy outfit, it's red and black, almost swimsuit kind of a thing. And her like arch enemy is the narrator of this little anthology movie thing, and it is called the Lochnar. The Lochnar is basically just a glowing green orb. And I'll maybe let people Google Lochnar if you want. I think it's spelled Locnar. But at any rate, as I understand it, I don't have the information in front of me right now, but as I understand it, it's supposed to be kind of like the avatar or the embodiment or the personification of absolute evil, right? And and so at any rate, we had said that she was on Earth in what was then the modern day. And so kind of a retcon we added years later was the Lochnar was too. There and we had the Lochnar in a couple of adventures in our game world. There used to be this image character called Max or the Max that was kind of a huge, massively muscular purple thing. He's like really hard to describe. He's got like buck teeth, and his fists have what always to me looked like he had dipped his forearms in like yellow paint and then like put his hands up in the air, so it was like kind of running a little bit up to the elbow. In a way, it kind of reminded me of like flames on the front of a car. If it's like a 57 Chevy or something, it's got flames painted on the front. Kind of like that kind of a thing, where he had like this yellow pattern on his hands. And then I think it was his middle fingers were these like big, chonky claws. At any rate, I'm spending entirely too much time talking about the Max, but they had this show on MTV about the Max that I loved. And I couldn't even tell you why we did it now. I did a really good impression of the Max. I could do the voice from the MTV show. We had this adventure where he was hunting the Lochnar. And like it was funny. It was a funny game. And I couldn't tell you now like why we chose that. Because the characters are completely unrelated. But like a friend of mine, Dave Eckelberger, pointed out years later, he's like, yeah, but you had the Lochnar in your game though, dude. Like one of the things the Lochnar does is it corrupts not only the people around it, but it corrupts even the environment. The Lochnar was in the city where all of our games took place. Everybody was looking for it for a while. He's like, that's kind of making all of your characters like it's gonna like warp their alignment or their motivation, a DC heroes terminology. They're gonna, a guy who's lawful good is maybe gonna drop down to like chaotic good, and if he's around the Lochnar more, he might be like chaotic neutral after a while, and someone that's holding the thing long enough is going to be like chaotic evil, and you know what I mean. But yeah, like so because of all these tensions people were experiencing out of game, right? Oh, the other thing I should mention, because this is worth mentioning. When my son was born, my son's on the spectrum for autism. Both my kids are. I think I am, but I haven't been diagnosed. But at any rate, So he did not sleep through the night until he was 4 years old. He cried for years, just nonstop. Um, my wife, I don't want to really get into it, but she wasn't, the doctors told her she'd never have kids. And both of our kids had a lot of health problems when they were young, and they were in and out of the emergency room. At least once a week, I was taking somebody to the emergency room, you know. My son had I think it's called a herniated belly button, where his belly button was hanging way out, and they were talking about having to do surgery. It's beyond the scope of the podcast, I guess. But the point is, he was an unhappy little guy, and he just cried and cried and cried. So for the first 4 years of his life, I was not sleeping. You know what I mean? And he was too much of a handful. Nobody would babysit him. I got no rest. And my mom had already died at that point and stuff, and my grandma died shortly thereafter, by the way. So like if you just never sleep, that is not great for your mood. You're not making good decisions. So the reason I mention it is this applies to the game, right? Is this little era in our game we look back on with a lot of embarrassment and regrets and stuff like that. And after the era was over, Dave Eckelberger was the one that's like, you know what though? But you had the Lochnar there the whole time. So that was kind of one of our retcons, or whatever you want to call it, was yes, the Lochnar was affecting the heroes. That's why they were so hell bent on revenge, so on and so forth, right? So so multiple things happen in the game then that are worth mentioning. The first is that we mentioned before that John Redbridge has a long history of working for the United States government. So we made the call that George W. Bush would contact John Redbridge and send him to the Middle East. And so the way we ran it was that he did a lot of damage. Um, and again, he is now affected by the Lochnar. We kind of retroactively said his eyes turned green. His eyes are normally blue. We said his eyes turned green because that's supposed to be the Lochnar having an effect on him. Interestingly enough, actually, around that time, there's an artist named Pat Lee. And back then, we would get all of our comic book information from something called Wizard Magazine. And Pat Lee did art that appeared in Wizard of the Transformers, and that led to Dreamwave Comics started putting out these very retro kind of 80s style Transformers comics. But one of the things Pat Lee did I thought was interesting was his Optimus Prime in this Wizard article. The way it looked to me was instead of Optimus having a blue helmet, he had a purple helmet, and he had purple hands and purple legs. All the red parts of Optimus Prime were still red, but all that stuff I mentioned was purple now, or at the very least, kind of an indigo color. And I think there's an argument to be had. The original 80s Optimus Prime toy, that is kind of indigo, right? It's not the same shade of blue you'd think of if you think of, say, the Sunbow cartoon. But then the other thing he did was he actually gave his Optimus Prime glowing green eyes. And I suspect that what he was doing was on the cartoon, Optimus Prime had blue eyes. Almost all the good guys had blue eyes. Um, but then the toy had yellow eyes. And so I think he was maybe trying to split the difference there. But I was so into Transformers at the time, I'd said the same thing about John Redbridge. That instead of wearing a red and blue outfit, he was suddenly wearing a red and purple outfit. Instead of having glowing blue eyes, he had glowing green eyes. Well, so like I said, we retconned this whole Lochnar thing, and we're saying was he's actually under the influence of the personification of evil, or the avatar, the embodiment of like absolute evil, right? So he goes to the Middle East and he does damage. And I remember we played it. We rolled dice and stuff. I invented towns, so we weren't using real towns. I don't even think we were necessarily using real countries. I know DC has a fictional country called Quirac. Um, I think we were using that. I know Transformers. They have a villain who is oh, I can't think who he's based on now. He's based on an actual kind of like a bad guy from the 80s that was in the news. But at any rate, we used the guy's name, the fictional character. I think his name is Abdul Fakardi, something like that. Um, but yeah, we were referencing that for sure. But yeah, Redbridge goes in and just stomps people, and we were very inspired by in the Watchmen comic book. Dr. Manhattan went to Vietnam, right? It was pretty much the same thing, almost verbatim the same thing. And there were a handful of guys playing in that game. We had a guy named Brian, for instance, who I don't know, he made some new character just for that I think was kind of a Captain America type guy, but he's going over there and just stomping people. Everybody was stomping people. And so the thing is though, and I mean, I'll let people draw their own conclusions about how this may or may not parallel real world events. The superheroes go in, take over an area, and they're like, well, we can't just leave because that doesn't really solve the problem. So we need to occupy this region, right? But so we had done this thing, and I mentioned this in our Pearl Harbor video. Our Pearl Harbor game was very famous, very popular, and it involved time travel. And it was a game that I had ran many, many, many times over the years. And so people sometimes would want the John Redbridge character then to, like, for instance, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, they'd be like, so you should go attack Japan and, deal with it. There's huge parallels here between these two and the sentiments involved and stuff like that. And so the timeline kept kind of flip-flopping between this scenario where he goes to Japan and he pulls a Riddick. If you've ever seen the Riddick movie where their thing was you keep what you kill, right? Part of the time he's doing that where he becomes the emperor of Japan, and then he goes and he kills the leader of Germany and takes over Germany and adds it to his empire. And at any rate, we ended up with this thing called the Terran Empire, where John Redbridge is basically the king of the world in that timeline. And they got flying cars and all sorts of stuff. And um, we've explored that a lot over the years in the game about, well, what are the moral implications of that, and is he like what a psychology class might, or not a psychology, I'm sorry, a philosophy class, often they'll talk about the idea of a benevolent dictator, you know. A lot of kings in fantasy stories, I would say, would fall under that category. So we kind of did that with him in a way, where we're like, well, he was Dagda and stuff like that. So he is kind of a fantasy character, and I think he would have an inclination towards being a king and running things like you would in the Middle Ages. Is a medieval king good or evil, right? So we would explore stuff like that. Well, so now that had come around again, and the people who were like, no, we don't want that to be the case, which is why I said the Pearl Harbor game had flip-flopped. And in the end, it created these two parallel timelines that permanently existed. One where there was a Terran Empire, one where there is not. So a lot of the players were like, you know what? Yeah, let's do the Terran Empire. Like unanimously, let's do the Terran Empire. And I think a lot of that was I started to mention this when I mentioned my kid not sleeping through the night. Almost all the players, this is the age we were when we were all getting married, we were all having kids. Nobody was sleeping good, right? Everybody now, we've gone from guys in our early 20s that are just partying all the time and screwing around and you know what I mean, to now we are buying our first house and we got bills to pay and so on and so forth. And so um there's a lot of frustration there that people want to vent or whatever, you know? And so that tends to translate as characters doing stuff in the game that's kind of bad, being more violent than usual or whatever. So now suddenly everybody wanted the Terran Empire. So what we did was we had the two timelines start to communicate so that the alternate John Redbridge from the other timeline where he did go attack Hirohito on like December 8th, 1941, right? And he has been an emperor since 1941. Emperor Redbridge is talking to the normal mainstream John Redbridge, that got sent to the Middle East to do stuff there. And the one who's the emperor is kind of like, look how bad your world has gotten. Like this is on you. You're just letting bad guys run roughshod all over your planet. People are dying on your watch. You know, you really need to take control of this. And at the time, everybody voted for it. So the mainstream John Redbridge was like, okay, I guess it's time for me to be an emperor. And again, we got the Lochnar playing into that. So, and then there's another part of this. It's like this is a multifaceted, is just really it's a mess. The more you think about it, the messier it gets. So the other thing going on was there were and not how do we want to put this? Not every story that takes place in this frame of time did we necessarily run that game that year. We've ran games since then that took place back then, stuff like that, right? Like I said, some of the Lochnar stuff was stuff we would run in like 2010 and things like that. And by the way, almost all of this gets undone because Marvel had this big event called House of M, where the Scarlet Witch warped reality and changed it. And even in their comic book, there's kind of this idea of a royal family where the Scarlet Witch is like royalty now because Magneto, her father, is royalty. Um, so there's a lot of parallels to be had there. So you can kind of think of this as our House of M era of the game, basically, right? Um, so a lot of this stuff gets undone later. So before anybody's like freaking out about it, it gets undone. We kind of came to our senses. A lot of the guys who had babies screaming every night, their babies start sleeping through the night and you start getting a little more rest. You start to think straight. And then there's the hindsight's 2020 thing as far as September 11th. Um, yeah. But so the Red Bridge who went to the Middle East takes over the Middle East. you know? Um, People are problems, and he just goes in and says, you humans are idiots, is one of the things he was doing at the time. Because on his character sheet, he was I won't go off on a big thing about it because in a way it kind of doesn't matter. We mentioned like how Torch became Pulsar and Shadowstorm became Umbra. It was this era where characters were getting like major cosmic upgrades, right? So the IQ we gave John Redbridge was higher than the IQ of the smartest human being ever. So from Redbridge's point of view, he thought characters like Reed Richards and Lex Luthor were just morons. From his point of view, they were over there in the corner crapping their pants and eating crayons, right? So he's like, why on earth would I let them vote? That was his take on it at the time. Um, so yeah, when he was in the Middle East, he was just like, yeah, no, I run things now. You guys can't be trusted to do anything. You're humans, you know? And a lot of people want to frame that era as kind of like, well, it's he's after a certain group of humans. No, not really. This really was kind of him saying, I'm done with humans. I think if there is any kind of a parallel to be had there, it's with Magneto, where he said, no, I am not a human being. I've just been living among you for centuries, watching your endless wars and stuff like that. We're going to have world peace now, whether you like it or not. Was kind of his thing. And so, of course, from his point of view, he thought he was being good. You know, I think it's pretty safe to say that all of our players now unanimously think he was not being good. But yeah, so it's a messy era of the game, but he takes over, and I could talk more about what happens after that. But this has already been a ridiculously long video, so I'm going to wrap this one up. I think just saying he takes over is plenty, right? And like I said, because I know this one is bound to upset people. I just know it is. Um, like I said at the beginning, we look back on a lot of this with regret. We retconned it where the Lochnar, was involved, and Scarlet Witch undoes all of this. At the end of the day, she she changes things back to not the Terran Empire and the mainstream universe that we have going on. So yeah. I'm gonna wrap this one up. Um as always, we'd love it if you uh were willing to support the channel. Um and you know the routine by now. Smash like, check to see if you're still subscribed because YouTube does love to unsubscribe you without telling you. We lost a couple more people this week and they came back and then they told me. Right. So it's always happening. Check to see if you're subscribed. And leave us a comment. Where were you? I think this would be the big one, right? I feel like this is what people kind of they like to commiserate and stuff. Where were you on September 11th of 2001? Assuming, because I know a lot of my listeners are young guys that were not born yet. Um, but for the guys who were, for us old timers, where were you that day? I'm always curious to hear that. Um, like I said earlier, my biggest one from that day is my best friend's wife would have lost her life if she wasn't home on maternity leave. Her office was destroyed. So in my group of friends, that's the big one, you know. But I've known, unfortunately, I have a friend named Connie. Her sister was in one of the towers, and Connie could see it from her apartment at the time, I guess. So she said she saw the whole thing happen. She lost her sister. Um, I got a friend named Joe. Uh, he knew a girl that was on one of the planes. So I would be curious. I'd be curious. You know, um, how it affected people. And I certainly hope this video didn't offend. That was not my goal. Um, but yeah, I'm gonna wrap this up. I'm gonna catch you guys in the next adventure.